Hello and welcome to Lab 9, the urinary system. So let's look at the urinary system. The main organs of that urinary system is that kidney. The outside of that kidney is surrounded by a capsule. That is that outer specific layer. The next layer in is that cortex. And then that medulla. I'm trying to color that stands out. It's kind of this entire area is that medulla. Okay. Now, if we're looking inside the kidney, I want to get rid of that circle. Oh, sorry. But in that circle there, we have these little almost diamond shaped items. They're not really, well, could be. They're pyramids. These are called those renal pyramids, and there's several of them. If you notice, there's one here, 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 and here. Those are all renal pyramids. Between those renal pyramids, we have renal columns. So that column is what separates those renal pyramids. At the bottom of that renal pyramid, come over here, we have this little kind of divot thing that comes down. That is that renal papilla. That renal papilla is helping to kind of drain all of that urine and everything that is being created, or that filtrate that has been created, out. From here, we're going to start with, I'm going to draw it over here. We have these two little areas, right? Let's try using pen. There we go. This area here and this area here. Those, you can also see it kind of pictured here. That is those minor calyx or minor calyces. Those minor calyces are going to come down and form this larger area here that I just drew in pink. That is that major calyx. Those major calyces are going to drain into that renal pelvis, which is this area through here. That renal pelvis is then going to drain into that ureter. So kind of that whole pathway following down. Didn't go through the individual nephron here, but you can at least see all of this going through. We also have the renal artery and the renal vein. So the artery that's bringing the blood in to be filtered, and the vein that's taking the blood that has been cleaned back out to the surrounding, or back out to the body. So let's keep looking. We got a lot of the same things here, just a different model. So we have that capsule along that outside. We can see that column, that area between those renal pyramids. At the bottom of that renal pyramid, we have that renal papilla, which is then going to drain first into those minor calyx. Those minor calyces are going to drain into that major calyx. That major calyx is going to drain into that renal pelvis. That renal pelvis is going to drain down to that ureter. Here they also have labeled the renal cortex, that outer layer of that tissue in that kidney. Again, we can see that cortex. You see that major calyx, that minor calyx, those pyramids, those ureters, that pelvis. Now, if we get down to the microscopic anatomy, we're going to look at the renal corpuscle. That renal corpuscle is where the initial draining of that, or creating that filtrate, occurs. So we have this afferent arteriole. Afferent is bringing the blood into this renal corpuscle. So as this blood comes through, it's going to come in this way. It's going to go through this glomulus, these capillaries. These capillaries are going to push out a lot of those waste products, plus a lot of extra stuff. What's helping to try to keep some of the stuff in our blood are these little cells here. Those little cells there are our podocytes. Those podocytes, again, are helping to kind of counteract some of that pressure that is happening in this renal corpuscle. After the blood has traveled through this glomulus, all these capillaries, they're going to exit through this efferent arteriole. So that is that blood that's now been filtered and is leaving. This entire thing is known as this glomerular capsule that is surrounding this glomulus. And this glomulus is going to drain into this proximal convoluted tubule. So here's just another kidney picture. This one starts going through this one gives some blood vessels, those arcuate vessels, artery and vein, that's going to travel around that renal pyramid. So you see those pyramids, that cortex, those minor calyces, that major calyx. Here you see those interlobar vessels too. That's why I included this one, because we've got these blood vessels that are going between those pyramids. Those are those interlobar. Here we get that renal papilla, that renal pelvis that drains into that ureter. Here we have the entire nephron. So we have that renal corpuscle. That renal corpuscle, once it creates that filtrate, it's going to drain into that proximal convoluted tubule. It's convoluted because you see it kind of zigzags around. From there, it's going to go through the loop of Henle. That loop of Henle that comes down and back up. That after we come back up, we get the distal convoluted tubule. This one isn't as convoluted as this one that's labeled as that cortical nephron. That distal convoluted tubule is a lot more convoluted. It kind of moves all over the place. Before this distal convoluted tubule is going to drain into this collecting duct, which is this white thing coming down that I am coloring green. That's that collecting duct. We have two different types of nephrons. We have the cortical nephron, which was this one is considered a cortical nephron. It stays mostly up in the cortex. No, that one's not a good one. This one's a good cortical nephron because it stays up towards the cortex. The medulla kind of starts where this line is here. The other nephron we have is the juxtamedullary nephron, which is this one because it goes down way into that medulla. They both drain into that collecting duct though. Here's another one where we can see some of these. Here are those afferent arterioles, those renal corpuscles, those efferent arterioles coming out. We've got that proximal convoluted tubule, that distal convoluted tubule, that loop of Henle that comes down and back up before it drains to that collecting duct. Here we see those interlobar vessels, those arcuate vessels. Here's just another picture of that renal corpuscle. All things. This one shows the podocytes labeled out for you, that efferent arteriole, the glomerular capillaries, the glomerular capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, that distal convoluted tubule that comes up and over. Here just shows those kidneys, but you can see the ureters. The ureters are what come off of those kidneys, and it's taking that now urine that's been created down to that bladder. So here's the bladder, that urinary bladder here. You can see that ureter coming down. The bladder, this is the male bladder. There's a muscular layer to both the male and the female bladder here. That muscular layer is that detrusor muscle. We can't see the trigon from this image. Keep looking, but we've got, in the part of the male urethra, we have the prosthetic urethra. That prosthetic urethra is the portion of this urethra here that is traveling through this prostate. This gland right here is known as the prostate. We'll do that in the male reproductive system, but that prostate, the urethra travels through it, which gives us that prosthetic urethra. Here you can see, again, those ureters coming down to that bladder that's sitting down there. Here's the female, or no, that's not the female, that is a male. My bad. This one we see the trigon though. The trigon, like at each corner of this trigon where I'm kind of coloring it blue, that is where that ureter is draining into that bladder. This only shows half of it, so that trigon would be an entire triangle that comes around. So then there'd be the other side that has the ureter from the other kidney that is draining into that bladder specifically. Then here we see that prosthetic urethra again. Here, see that prosthetic urethra. Here is part of that trigon with that opening right there. That's where that ureter attaches and drains urine into that bladder. Here's the female bladder. The female bladder sits below the uterus. So here's that ureter, here's that bladder. The female urethra is a lot shorter than that male urethra, which is why females are more prone to urinary tract infections. So we've got some slides here. I'm not going to ask you histology, but it kind of gives you an idea of some of this other stuff going on. You can see that renal corpuscle with that glomeralis inside. You can see some of these collecting ducts, those loops of Henle traveling. So you can kind of see a lot of these different tissues. I'm not going to ask you this stuff. This is kind of here just for your information. You can see that transitional epithelium in that bladder that allows that bladder to stretch. Here's that ureter. You can see that ureter stays mostly closed when there's nothing in it. Again, it's going to have that transitional epithelium again to allow that ureter to stretch. And that is everything on the urinary system. Thank you very much for listening.